Today we have another full day of wonderful, challenging and really important sessions, talks, and we will start with our keynote speaker. Today's keynote speaker is Professor David Schmidtz from the University of Arizona. I met David not long time ago. It was late March, early April, when I contacted Professor Schmidtz for the first time, being advised by our common friend and sponsor from Phoenix. I was there at Project Arizona, and I contacted Professor Schmidtz mostly about this conference. I wanted to invite Professor for this conference, and we met. I went to Tucson, which is a beautiful city, believe me, and the university has an amazing campus. And we met and we discussed this conference, but also we discussed other issues. For example, Professor Schmidtz is author of a number of books, which are very, very good, well-written, intellectual books. And he told me that it might be a good idea to publish them in Poland, for instance. And since Freedom and Entrepreneurship Foundation is in the business of publishing books, I said, this is a great idea. I already made small research about these books, and I said, I would love to publish the Brief History of Liberty as the first book. And he said, great choice. So that was like early April, and today it's August, and we already have this book published in Polish language. It's called Krótka Historia Wolności. It's co-authored with Jason Brennan, so two authors, David Schmidtz and Jason Brennan, and it's a great book that talks about the most important moments in the history when liberty was winning. But since the book is in Polish, I encourage people who read Polish language to get this book. You can buy it either here in the corridor, we are selling it, but also I want to invite you day after the conference is finished, on August 16th, here in this very same room, we are organizing open meeting with Professor David Schmidtz at 6 p.m. And this meeting will be dedicated to this book solely. Not to take too much time, I just want to tell you that Professor David Schmidtz is head of the Department of Political Economy and Moral Science at the University of Arizona. And the most important information is that this very department is #1 in the world in political philosophy, not just this year, for the last 8 years. This is the best department of political philosophy. So these people really know the matter very well. And additionally, Professor Schmidtz is also head and founder of the Center for Philosophy of Freedom at the University of Arizona in Tucson. So we are very excited and blessed to have Professor David Schmidtz with us here, and I am moving the microphone to him. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jacek. Thanks to all the young people for participating in this, and thanks for all the old people who used to be young but are still dreaming. So yeah, welcome everyone. So I want to talk about the Scottish Enlightenment. I want to say that there is something that has happened in philosophy, academic philosophy, that has made it something esoteric, something that isn't really part of practical affairs anymore, something that is done at universities and pretty much ignored outside of universities. That was not always the case. It happened in the 1800s. There was a moment when that happened. And to explain, I'm going to start with the 1700s, with the Scottish Enlightenment. This was a heady time for Enlightenment scholars, that Western civilization was taking shape, taking its modern shape. Europe had never been more optimistic. David Hume and Adam Smith were following Galileo and then Isaac Newton, on a quest to quote the subtitle of Hume's treatise, introduce the method of experimental reasoning into moral subjects. The scientific method was still being worked out, but people were starting to realize that science was not like geometry. It's not about proof, it's about evidence, not the same thing. If you asked Adam Smith whether tariffs are just, what would he say? He wouldn't say, here's my proof. He would say, well, let's check what happens to unemployment rates. Let's check what happens to prices. And then once we check that, then we say, well, that doesn't prove anything. You can say it doesn't prove anything, but if it were me, given the effects that trade wars have on working class people, I would not want to be the one who got caught calling it just. Not a proof, but that's the way science is done, actually. So, among philosophers, this Scottish observation-based approach was called empiricism. By the late 1800s, John Stuart Mill was taking the empiricist approach to its logical limit. He was arguing that literally everything we know comes to us by experience and experiment. We draw inferences from observed regularities. Even propositions like 2 + 2 = 4 are learned by generalizing from observed results. So in his day, Mill was an influential and respected, visible apostle of the new moral sciences. So he was taken very seriously when, in a series of works culminating in 1848 with the publication of Principles of Political Economy, Mill separated the study of how goods are produced from the study of how goods are distributed. That's what you do for the sake of analytical rigor and tough-minded science. If two things can be separated, separate. Here's a further thought. Mill thought humanity had largely exhausted the frontier of technological progress. It seems like a joke today, but for the 2,000 years, it's always been true that, one of the leading lights, one of the leading intellectuals has thought we pretty much tapped out on technological progress. Like, what's going to happen next? Are we going to be able to fly through the air? There's always been someone who said you can't imagine any further progress. Now, to be sure, the telegraph was invented in 1837 by the time Mill publishes Principles of Political Economy. They're right in the middle of planning to lay transatlantic cable. So by 1848, lots of thinkers thought that electricity's potential, particularly on the frontier of distance communication, was far from exhausted. So even as Mill was writing, there was lots of room to doubt what he was saying, doubt that a steady state economy was around the corner, and doubt that better distribution was the only remaining avenue for substantial human progress. But for whatever reason, Mill did believe that the coming age would be an age of an economic steady state with relatively little news on the production side. Progress would come via better distribution, not rising productivity, which made distribution the central topic of the moral sciences. And today, we don't even remember John Stuart Mill pressing that distinction. And we don't remember that we just took Mill's word for it because he was the guy in moral science. And we went along with him. Today, we can't see how spurious that distinction is. We can hardly imagine not treating production and distribution as separate topics. But sometimes what looks like two things is really one thing, like the evening star and the morning star, or a single process, not really separable into producing and distributing, that Adam Smith called the wealth of nations. That's a process, that's not an outcome. If we presume to treat those things as separate just because they seem separable, we can end up being misled. So in the aftermath of Mill's distinction, philosophy was further cut off from scientific study of what makes some societies more productive than others. The empirical studies, they had all become the province of some other department. Within departments of philosophy themselves, well, how can you tell that philosophy is painting itself into a corner and increasingly putting itself in a position of not having anything to say about the real world? Well, that impact isn't detectable by the tools left to philosophy, like to analyze the meanings of concepts or words in ordinary language. But although we couldn't detect what were doing to ourselves, it was still a momentous impact. Since philosophy and political economy came apart, political economy separated from philosophy around 1800, then around 1900, the marginal revolution in economics led economics to separate from political science as well. That's not that long ago. But we were left to portray what society produces as a pie, as you know, right? That is, as a thing rather than a process. We treat justice, because we're philosophers, we treat justice as a question of how to treat the pie, because pie is the thing that we can study with the analytical tools that we have left. Questions about what produces the pie weren't part of philosophy anymore. They had become social science, and that's right. So what philosophy was equipped to handle was intuitions, right? A priori intuitions regarding what to count as a fair way of dividing the pie. So philosophy today is like this. We look at a snapshot of a busy intersection and we see how arbitrary it is that some people have green lights and other people have red lights. How unfair is that? We focus on the snapshot because cause and effect and empirical generalizations about the process, those things are their own autonomous social sciences now. Where pie comes from, it's not philosophy, it's social science. How people navigate in their communities and which ways of managing traffic work better than others, social science. What works? Social science. What's fair? That's philosophy. If we set aside social science, though, and just look at the snapshot of social life at its busy intersections where traffic is congested and conflicts of interest become apparent, well, then we can have a vision, an intuition, a concept that's beyond testing, beyond refutation. Something like this. In an ideal world, everyone would have a green light at the same time. Now, of course, we all see the impracticality. And, that's sort of a metaphor, sort of not. Like it's a real issue. Traffic management is a real issue. Whose turn it is, it's a real issue. We have solved that problem so well that we don't understand that we even have a problem anymore. And that's what happens when you're really good at solving a problem. You don't realize you even have one. But it's sort of like this. Somebody says, he gets paid twice as much, like actual case, you've probably heard, he gets paid twice as much as I do. Well, you're 20, son, he's 40, he's been doing this for 20 years, his labor's worth more than yours. Like twice? I don't know. But anyway, it's worth more than yours. No, we should all get paid the same. We should all get paid the same right now. So like, equality has nothing to do with that. Like real equality, it's not about snapshot. It's about process equality. It's about saying, do I live in a world in which when I'm 40, I'll be making as much as that person is making? Well, no, you don't. You'd probably be making 3 times as much as that person is making. Right? So what's unequal now? What's unfair? Do we say, is the world unfair to the 20-year-old or to the 40-year-old? There's no answer, so long as we're just looking at a snapshot. There's no way to say anything about it until you say, let's think about the process. Let's think about the kind of life you want to live. Hey, you 20-year-old, do you really think justice requires that you spend the next 20 years, when you're 40, you won't have ever gotten a raise? Is that what you think justice requires? Is that your egalitarianism? Yeah, probably not, if you think about it. So, there was a time when we knew that justice has roughly nothing to do with how we treat the pie. and everything to do with how we treat bakers. If we set aside everything that we've learned about the terms of engagement under which bakers are better off living together, then there's no testable answer to the question of how to divide the pie. There are only untestable intuitions. We know, now I say that, but you know, I know, everybody knows, in some sense, justice is not merely a matter of intuition. It's not just a matter of opinion. But the way we do philosophy today, that's what we're implying, even though we say that that's not what we're implying, but it is. When we start treating philosophy as outside the realm of empirical test, that's where we end up. I used to teach different theories, and then my students would say, is this going to be on the exam? You betcha. And they'd say, okay, well then what's the answer? I say, you got to figure this out for yourself. And they'd say, okay, so I got it. It's all subjective. It's like, no. It's all relative. No. It's all a matter of opinion. No. And they'd say, Professor, you're not making any sense. 10 years later, I realized, no, they were right. I was wrong. So under that ultimately unbearable constraint, that unbearably artificial narrowing of the scope of philosophy, Adam Smith knew that specialization was good, but he could have told you there's such a thing as over-specialization too. I think philosophy isn't exactly over-specialized. The social sciences are over-specialized. Philosophy is kind of, in some way, worse than over-specialized. It's what's left over after all of those things leave it behind. That's even worse than being over-specialized. It's under-theorized in some way. So, Hume and Smith saw economic justice as pertaining to an ongoing process, not an outcome. To Hume, we assess patterns of mutual expectation. So we look at conventions, and we know that not all conventions command respect. Hume had a theory that the conventions that command respect are the ones that are useful or agreeable to self or others. It's kind of interesting that there's an or there. We assess how people are treating each other. We assess how they expect to be treated. And then to Hume, well, we ask, how well are people doing? Are they happier and healthier if they expect one thing rather than another? To Smith, the question is even more pointedly empirical. We assess conventions in terms of how they affect the wealth of nations. How do wealthier societies manage commercial traffic? What are the documented consequences of alternative trade policies? How do they affect prices? How do they affect unemployment? Those questions mattered. Those questions had testable answers. Those questions didn't prove anything about justice, but they had everything to do with justice. What we call proof, not so much. So what happened? Was Mill really that pivotal? Well,
This would be better.
okay. Is this better? You guys agree? This one is cranked up. Yes. Okay. Well, we will assess how these alternative microphones affect the wealth of nations presently. So, historical, we'll see about this. Well, historical records never really settle why things happen as they do. They just suggest. That's all they do. They don't.
Oh, the other one's better.
Just start shouting.
Yeah. Okay. Geometry is all about proof. Geometry is about proof, and we once thought that geometry was all about was a model of science, and we now know that it isn't. Geometry is about proof. You derive things from axioms. Science isn't like that. Science is about evidence. So I'm going to give you 3 alternative correlations. So maybe Mill wasn't the only villain in this story. And I think he was.
Yeah, just give us one moment. We need to exchange the battery in that one, and then we will.
I might as well carry on because we're going to run out of time anyway. So I'm going to discuss 3 additional correlations, and you can make up your own mind about what these correlations have to do with each other, how much these correlations have to do with causation. So the next thing is that utilitarianism parts ways with self-interest. Not long after Mill separated production and distribution, Henry Sidgwick separated egoism from utilitarianism as methods of ethics, which is methods of figuring out what to do. And he said that these methods of ethics could not be reconciled except by God, maybe. But once utilitarianism and egoism were artificially separated, it's kind of interesting. It got harder to think of utilitarian moral analysis as having anything to do with managing incentives implicit in institutional structures so as to be able to predict which institutions work, which actually serve the common good. The reality of what works, that's for planners and practitioners, traffic managers, social scientists, anything but philosophers. So keep that in mind. That'll be relevant to some of these other things as well. Also after Mill, utilitarianism gradually became a philosophy that is officially about maximizing something, but actually it's all about distributing. Culminated in Peter Singer's Famine, Affluence, and Morality in 1972. Singer wouldn't characterize his view this way today, not the way he did in 1972, but he inspired his followers, of which there are many, to suppose that utilitarianism's one and only moral duty is to check your pocket to see whether there's any money rattling around in there. And if there is, then being moral involves putting that money somewhere else, wherever someone needs that money more than you do. So long as someone somewhere has a better use for the money than you do, being moral is entirely a matter of giving until you have nothing left to give, or until you have nothing that anyone needs more than you do, until you'd be the next one to starve if you gave away your last dollar. Productivity? Well, that's something that we encourage, but only as a means to an end, not because productivity is a virtue that commands respect. Not because productivity is an achievement that commands admiration. So before Mill, utilitarians like Adam Smith, or vaguely utilitarians anyway, they worked on the nature and source of the wealth of nations. They studied property rights and other tools of commercial traffic management. Since Mill, and certainly by the time of Singer's essay, we were beginning to ask questions like, how many of you heard this question before? What if you had the opportunity to prevent a runaway trolley from killing 5 innocent people, but only at a cost of killing 1 innocent person? Anybody heard that before? Yeah.
Now,
So that question is notoriously about intuitions. It's about ideas that we cling to that seem right, but we can't actually test. We can't test them, that is, until we head back up to the road to the contingent, empirical, institutional sorts of questions that utilitarian philosophers asked before Mill. Like, how do communities work? How do hospitals work? Why do hospitals, like, exactly never have a policy of allowing or requiring doctors to kill 1 innocent patient whenever they could save 5 innocent patients by doing so? Before Mill, we treated such questions as testable and answerable. We observe that the way to minimize the number of killings in our world is not to issue licenses to kill, but to make killing illegal. The question of whether it's right to kill 1 to save 5, it has no answer as a question about the snapshot. You just have your intuitions, I have mine, it's never going to be over. But, by contrast, as a question about what makes real world social and political animals willing to trust each other, what makes societies tick, what gives us a framework for living good lives together, that question has an answer. If we investigate, if we observe, well, we observe there isn't much conflict between a utilitarian imperative to promote value and a deontological imperative to respect value. Real community promotes value by requiring members to respect value. We don't see that when we look at the snapshot. You have to check the process. So final thought on utilitarian ethics is questions about how to act replaced social science questions about what works. So Hume understood whether doing the right thing maximizes value in a particular case. From a utilitarian perspective, that just doesn't matter that much. Justice is more about process than about outcome. Theorizing about justice isn't theorizing about what the ideal destination would be. It's about how traffic should be managed. Managing traffic is a matter of settling whose turn it is, not who has the superior destination. That makes justice an egalitarian rather than an aristocratic virtue. The function of justice is to enable everyone to share an understanding of whose turn it is, and for everyone to be able to know when to expect their turn. To Hume, that's it. Justice has no further point. But that's enough to make justice the foundation of a peaceful, thriving community of equals. And indeed, Hume thought that property rights are society's most consequential traffic management device. They embody a right to say no. Like you said, no, you don't cross that line. I said no, no means no. It's my life. So property rights embody a right to say no and walk away from offers that are inferior. A profound equality of status and a profound driver of human progress there that you can't see if you only look at the snapshot. If you only look at the snapshot, you will start thinking that equality is something else, something other than that, something distinctly illiberal. So no one thinks a system of property allocates property rights efficiently at any given moment. Nobody thinks those dollars in your pocket, that nobody thinks that someone doesn't need them more than you do. You don't think that. Nobody thinks that. That isn't what matters. What matters is traffic management, right? Satisfying yourself that people with different intuitions about your destination are unreasonable, that's what we do in philosophy nowadays, and it doesn't help. Okay, so the fourth and final thing, 1903, another towering philosopher, G.E. Moore, he publishes Principia Ethica and transforms the is-ought problem into one of moral philosophy's core puzzles. And it continues to stump us to the present day. So here's the problem, and you've already seen me setting up the elements of this. Deductive logic cannot get us from premises about what is the case to conclusions about what ought to be the case, or conclusions about what ought to be done. David Hume, as early as the mid-1700s, he understood the problem. Some say Hume invented it. He certainly drew our attention to it. But Hume had a genius for identifying skeptical problems and puzzles of all kinds, and Hume did not treat the is-ought problem as unique. Hume used the is-ought problem to model a key feature of scientific reasoning. Scientific reasoning is a process of collecting data, then formulating hypotheses about what could cause the data to look like that, what could be underlying this process. We don't exactly deduce what explains the data, neither do we directly observe causation. We observe correlation, and then we jump to a conclusion about what explains the data. Then we test our theory by seeing how well it predicts what we observe under controlled experimental conditions. That's science. Interesting conclusions generally are not proven in the way philosophers are taught to think of proof. Hume understood the is-ought problem. Does it tell us something about morality? Yeah, but actually it's bigger than that. It tells us something about the scientific method. Namely, science doesn't generate new knowledge by deduction. Hume went some way toward doing what he said he would do, which is establishing moral subjects as on a par with natural science. Most knowledge, including scientific and moral knowledge, is of truths other than necessary truths, other than truths that are deducible from certain axioms. We missed his point. So it's part of human nature. Experiment, guess, take risks, make mistakes, learn fast. Proof is rare. Evidence is everywhere. We look at facts, we see reasons, we derive reasons from facts 100 times a day, but not by deducing. And that doesn't mean facts aren't relevant, and we've known this since we were toddlers, right? This first time, do you remember this experiment? We've all done this. Stove, glowing red spiral. Pretty? How does it feel? Okay, so what's it? Premise. Hand is burning. Conclusion. Ought to move that hand. That is not valid reasoning, but it's not a mistake. It's jumping to a conclusion, and life is about jumping to conclusions that often aren't mistaken, but often are. So, 7 to 10 million Ukrainians died in the Holodomor. Conclusion. Don't try socialism again. Not like that. Not authoritarian socialism. Somebody can say, well, that doesn't prove anything. Well, it's sort of true that it doesn't prove anything, but you still better not try that again. Okay. So the lesson isn't that there's no truth about how we ought to live, but as a matter of empirical observation, deductive logic isn't what moves us from factual premises to conclusions about how to live. Of course we make mistakes. The conclusions we jump to, that scientists jump to, are often mistaken. What's crucial is not exactly to avoid mistakes so much as being slow to admit mistakes. That's what'll kill you. So my conclusion then, to Hobbes, going back to the 1600s, human action orbits around a goal of personal survival. So we call Hobbes an egoist in our introductory courses. But of course, there's more to that story. To Hobbes, we're born at the center of our universe, so we have an egocentric bias. Now, our egocentrism fosters what? In fact, the consequence of egocentrism is not enlightened self-interest, but what Hobbes called vainglory, what today we would call vanity. Other people see the world from a different perspective. They don't see that we're at the center of the universe, which is really infuriating. It's kind of insulting. So everything that the people around us do is an implicit insult and an unending provocation, which makes us far more violence-prone than simple self-interest would ever lead us to be. So we spend our lives retaliating against those whose universe doesn't revolve around us, convincing ourselves that someone else fired the first shot. So realistic political economy's core insight is actually pretty optimistic by comparison with that. We observe not that people who acquire power are necessarily vicious or even self-interested, but simply that people who run courts and legislatures and so on are a lot like people who run businesses or households. Some want money, some want power. The people who devote their lives to acquiring power, they're probably the ones that want power. If they seem like bad people, well, it's easy to say we need to elect better people. But at all levels of institutional design, the real task is about the process. It's about finding a framework that motivates manifestly imperfect people to act in ways that serve the common good. Realistic political economy comes to grips with the fact that the rules of the game are built and then rebuilt endlessly from the inside by players competing, negotiating, compromising. But Hobbesian vanity makes people homicidally overconfident in the rightness of their vision. So the men of system, that's Adam Smith's phrase, they're public-spirited in a way, but when they see that others don't share their vision, they're too vain to realize that their vision is actually tunnel vision. And the reason why others aren't marching toward the same destination is there's no reason why they should. So in the marketplace, if you're wrong, your trading partners say, not good enough, they walk away, you go back to the drawing board and try to think like, what better service can you provide? But when it comes to political decision making, the discipline of the market in which people pay for their own mistakes or pay for other people not wanting what they're trying to sell, that just isn't there. So that's the straightforward liberal ideal of good government that comes out of the Scottish Enlightenment and Hobbesian contractarianism and the American founding. A community is a game, citizens are players, let the players play. Why is that a liberal ideal? It was something new under the sun when Hobbes, nothing liberal about Hobbes, but Hobbes, I still mark Hobbes as the inventor of liberalism because he asked a deceptively simple question. Why should subjects obey the king? What's in it for them? So the liberal idea is that citizens bring hopes and dreams of their own to the game. Liberalism begins with the insight that kings don't own their subjects. No one is anyone else's property. No one decides what other people are for. No one decides what other people's destinations are. Good governors are good referees. Good referees let the players play. So why do some people want to be referees? Well, once they become referees, what stops them from cooperating with other referees to turn refereeing from the unobtrusive thing it should be into an extravaganza of rent-seeking and power-grabbing for referees? So meanwhile, philosophy, we're back at the Ivory Tower Ranch. We're still imagining how to divide the pie. We have no right. Political philosophy's profound task is to imagine how to avoid dividing the pie, which is in part a task of imagining a vision of justice that is non-colonial, non-threatening, that simply manages the traffic and otherwise lets people be. Thank you.
We have time for questions. Around 20 minutes, so anybody willing to ask the question to the professor?
Your name, please? Yeah.
I'm Laura.
Laura?
Yes, I was thinking about what you said about like the deontological respect being like coincident with utilitarian promotion of value. And so what you said about like the process of like creating wealth, do you think like just taking like a deontological perspective, for example, like if we were to like take a punt and say that the maxim that we're going to try to universalize would be like when there is wealth redistributed equally, do you think that like trying to universalize that would be impossible because it would create like a practical contradiction because doing that would destroy the existence of wealth in the first place or not allow it to be created? Is like that kind of what you're saying with those two frameworks?
I like that analysis, Laura. Yeah, thank you. That works for me. Let me just sort of drop the markers.
Ooh, dangerous.
Yeah. You know what a prisoner's dilemma is, Laura? Okay, so forgive me, those of you who don't have the background for this. I really don't worry about it. But for those who have studied it at all, you could say if neither person cooperates, they don't get anything. They get the best possible outcome if they. I should change this. They get the best possible joint outcome, the best possible collective outcome if they both cooperate. And there are reasons embedded in that payoff structure why they won't cooperate when they make their choice between cooperating and not cooperating. There's two ways for a Kantian to look at this. One way to look at this is just to see it as a snapshot and say, what could I universalize here? And one thing you can universalize is unconditional cooperation. Unconditional cooperation will get you to the universalizable outcome. But it doesn't work that way if you think about the process. If you think about the process, you say, wait a minute, if I say I'm going to unconditionally cooperate, I'm going to be teaching my partner to free ride on me. That's not universalizable. What's universalizable is reciprocity, not unconditional cooperation. So if you just look at a snapshot, you can't tell the difference between reasons why you could universalize reciprocity and reasons why you could universalize unconditional cooperation. In fact, you can't universalize unconditional cooperation, but you can universalize reciprocity. So that's, I think we have developed a theory of non-strategic utilitarianism. And I think, that can be made pretty clear. It's harder, you're asking a harder question than that. But my answer is the same. We've developed a non-strategic version of deontology and universalizability. And what we would need to bring that back to the real world where people can work with it is think about strategic deontology. And there should be such a thing as strategic deontology. And right in front, you had a question? You still got a question? No, you look terrified, so I will. I can't universalize forcing you to speak. So, please.
So I have a question. You have a written paper in a few pages about this looking in a snapshot and as a process, because looking by snapshot it's a reductionist thinking, and looking for the process it's systemic thinking. So it's a big difference, and I read a very interesting book by Tom Elpel, The Roadmap to Reality, when he shows that there is 10 levels of thinking. And the third one is reductionist thinking, the fourth one is systemic thinking, and the majority of Americans stays on third level of the snapshotting.
Well, thank you. That sounds like something that I could get on board with. I guess I don't, even if I thought that there were different levels of thinking and that I was on the highest level and that everybody else was on a lower level than me, I would never admit that. So I would never talk that way. So yeah, that's why in my own writing I wouldn't say there are levels of moral maturation or sophistication, and I occupy the top of that pyramid. Even though I do think that there are stages through which people move, and maybe not everybody stops at the same place. I don't think that's exactly right. I think it's some people get frozen in a particular place by a particular conviction. And it's not like they couldn't move and don't sometimes move. It's just that for in that particular context, they don't move. Like, so you say, like if, I talked about a 20-year-old and a 40-year-old. Like, imagine like a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old, right? The 5-year-old says, "Daddy, where's my bike?" Yeah. And Daddy says,
it's the first
pardon?
level of thinking.
Yeah, so like, pardon? And you say, well, you gave Billy a bike. Yeah, but it's Billy's 8th birthday. You get a bike on your 8th birthday. Just like Billy got a bike on his 8th birthday. It's like, Daddy, you're not treating us as equals. Like, he has a bike, I don't have a bike, fix the problem. And then the other thing, which maybe you suggest as well, is, if a person never stops, and most people do not stop at that level, they grow up. But they don't necessarily grow up in every context, right? So you can... Right? So there are plenty of people like walking around my department and say, gee, that person gets paid $500 more than me and has published 3 fewer articles than me. And you say, what do you say? Grow up. Right? You're in the 1th percentile, of income in the world, just like him. It's like, yeah, it's like grow up, right? So, yeah, I guess... and there's all kinds of other things that we could talk about where you say, when you see somebody else doing that, you could look, you want to look in the mirror. I want to look in the mirror and say, when do I do that? Like, how do I want to make sure I never get caught doing that. I want to make sure I never catch myself doing that. So you learn that, it's not grown up to look at little differences and see them as tokens of inequity, right? You say there is such an incredible gradation of human welfare. And, the people are like basically all up there. Like, they're the ones who have the luxury of feeling envy. These people are like worrying about survival, right? And so, yeah. I'm looking for students. Are you a student? You're not a student.
I'm not, but
You're the youngest guy with a hand up, so I'll call on you.
well, I wanted to go back to what you said about the trolley problem. And
Okay.
for me, I think that kind of demonstrates some of the limits of absolute moral truth. Because I talk to a lot of deontological ANCAPs who say, like, they would never, under any circumstances, pull that lever. Like, let's say it was, instead of 1 in 5, let's say it was like 1 in a billion people. And they say, yeah, it's the moral thing to do in this situation is to let the 1 billion die and not pull the lever for the 1.
Yeah.
And for me, that kind of demonstrates there's a limit to, you know, deontological ethics and morality, and it's not an absolute. There is some number and some point at which you got to move. Like, I think for me, it involves scale. And at some point, when you zoom out and you have a large enough scale, I think consequentialism becomes the more rational position.
Yeah, thank you. What's your name?
Bronson.
Rodzu?
Bronson.
Thanks. That might be right. That's not my view. My view might be wrong, but I'll tell you 2 things about my view. First of all, I would say I think that there are moral absolutes in the real world. I don't mean in theory, I mean in the real world I think there are moral absolutes. So I would say killing off the table, period. And you would say, but Dave, if 1 billion people would die if you didn't commit murder, then what? And then I'd say, I don't live in that kind of world. If 1 billion lives were actually at stake, then what I believe wouldn't be true. I'll tell you that. But 1 billion lives aren't at stake, never have been, never will be. And as long as I live in the world that I live in, the right attitude is to have this commitment as an absolute. Right? In the real world, we have to be able to trust each other. We don't have to be able to trust each other to save 1 billion lives. We have to be able to trust each other not to kill. So I would say that. And so it's part of my theory that I didn't prove anything by saying that. So if you want to disagree, I'm not going to say you're being unreasonable. Now, the other thing is, I'll tell you about the trolley problem in Kazakhstan. There kind of was a trolley problem in Kazakhstan. So I was teaching a course on justice. This is more than 10 years ago in Almaty in Kazakhstan. And I trotted out the trolley problem. You know, there's 5, 1 trolleys. And people said, well, but you must be able to derail the trolley. No. You must be able to shout out a warning. No. And they said, no, there's always something you can do. Right? You don't have to kill somebody to save 5. And I said, no, please, ladies and gentlemen, can you get on target here? Can you get with the program? I'm telling you, 5, which is more, 5 or 1, like 5 versus 1. You know, get focus with me for a minute, help me with focus. And so they called a timeout and they talked among themselves in Russian for a bit, and they came back and they said, okay, we talked this over and we realized that people have been telling us this all our lives. They've been telling us that the few have to be sacrificed for the sake of the many. And the thing is, it's a lie. It was always a lie. There was always another way. We never had to sacrifice the few. And I said, okay, I guess class is over for the day because I have no answer to that. I think you're probably just plain right. And so that's the thing about philosophy is we say, let's talk about 1 billion to 1 if 5 to 1 doesn't impress you. Now let's talk about 1 billion to 1. And when people say, but the real world isn't like that, that's relevant. Right? So we say we need to talk about every possible hypothetical to make sure we're talking about necessary truths. That's the reason. That's why counterexamples matter in philosophy, is because they go to the question about whether what we're saying is necessarily true. Well, what we have to deal with is, the fact is, what we're saying isn't necessarily true. And the counterexamples, we should just think that that's interesting. Not think that the counterexamples don't prove anything either. But if you say, if somebody says, okay, I just gave, you said, no, it's got to be like this, and you came up with a counterexample that is very close to how the real world works. I've pretty much seen that case before. Then I need to say, well, now you're talking about something that's practically, possibly at least decisive. And now I have to think about it. So if you say, well, what if hydrogen had 2 electrons? And right, what if, like, no, come on. So that's you know.
But the trolley problem is just simplifying a moral question. Like we could say, what if it was a mad scientist and he'd come up with some device, you know, like it doesn't have to be a trolley.
Yeah, that's true. It doesn't have to be a trolley. But the question is what were you actually trying to prove?
Maybe there's a limit to saying that you can't, it's not always necessarily.
Well, if you say there's a limit and you say theoretically there's a limit, those are 2 different things. Yeah, please, go ahead. I don't know. No, behind you had his hand up first. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just going to sort of pick up Bronson's idea. We're saying, well, the example is out of this world, it's not real. Well, I think there have been real examples of scale or degree mattering, and one that just immediately comes to my mind is the decision to drop the atomic bomb.
Yep.
That was a decision to kill tens of thousands to save what was believed to be 1 million in an invasion. And normally, any rational person would say, we're not going to kill tens of thousands of people.
Yep.
But there was the alternative. It was a disastrous number. So scale did matter in that decision. And I think it was a moral decision.
Yeah, that's that's interesting. The complexity that illustrates is that there are parts of morality that are role specific. So if you say, what are our duties? You answer the question one way, but if you say, no, now let's suppose you're the school principal. Nah, that's different. Now let's suppose you're a policeman. Like, do you get to hit somebody now? Well, no, if you're a policeman, it's different. The rules are different when you're a policeman. What if you are the commander-in-chief of the armed forces? And you say, yeah, that's different. Why is that different? Because the rule applying to normal citizens is don't kill, period. That doesn't apply to soldiers, doesn't even apply to police, doesn't apply to the commander-in-chief. So the commander-in-chief is subject to the commander-in-chief has a role that's more utilitarian than a regular citizen's role. Has to be that way. Has to be that way. That's the commander-in-chief's job, is to minimize the loss of life. Not many other people's job, but it's a commander-in-chief's job. So, yeah, you're right about that. And you're right that that's a real-world case as well. So I'll accept that.
We can take only one more question. Professor, choose from whom it should be.
Okay.
The comment about the trolley, some philosophical questions, as you know, have no answer. And
Yep.
the process of asking the question is in itself impossible to formulate. The trolley problem has one answer, a second answer, no answers, both answers. I'll give you an example. Suppose that the single person were a Nobel Prize winner who has solved the problem of life extension, and the 5 people were farm workers. Or suppose that the 5 people were all Nobel Prize winners collectively who have solved the problem, and the 1 person was a farm worker. So with additional information, you can make a decision to differentiate based on your value system. What would you say is the proper answer to that conundrum?
I don't know, but one of the most sort of tear-jerking versions of the case that I can think of. It's Ursula Le Guin has a short story, and the pivotal noun in the title is this. Omelas. It's a plant, the name of a planet. Anybody remember the whole title of it? But yeah, that's a story about a utopia where everybody is happy and healthy, nobody ever dies, and life is great, except that there's a dungeon at the bottom of City Hall someplace where there is a baby being tortured forever. Basically, one person has to go to hell in order for everybody else to make it to heaven. And so she says, the story is to say, what's going on here? What's up with that? Is that permissible? And the answer is, well, you can make a case either way. But if you were trying to be realistic, then you would say, no, you can't torture the baby because that's not the actual situation. And if you say, but what if it were? It's like, well, if it were, that would be very different from anything that morality evolved to cope with. So our intuitions wouldn't be relevant. But what is relevant is that we live in a world in which that's not our choice. We live in a world in which it's just plain wrong to torture babies. Thank you.
Thank you very much.